Well, hi and welcome back to my YouTube channel. It's Friday here in Adelaide. Quite a mild day, a bit overcast, a bit windy, not too hot, not too cold. Anyway, that's the weather report. So today I thought I would begin a series which I might go for 3 or 4 episodes. I'm never short of ideas about what to put on this YouTube channel. And probably I lead all the people who view it on a bit of a merry dance, going from this to that and something else. However, this is the Christian side of things today, and I'm going to try and attempt to do a little bit of a series on the books that have changed my life, or the content that's in the books. The books don't change your life at all, but the direction that they point you in and how you can get there is what actually changes your life when you read a book such as what I'm going to talk about today. Well, the first one I'm going to deal with is a book called The Ins and Out of Rejection. Notice I said out, not ins and outs, but ins and out. Lots of ins to feeling rejected, but only one out is what this author is saying. Anyway, if you read the book, you'll find out what he means. So I'm going to talk about that, and also his name is Dr. Charles Solomon. I alluded to him in the notes underneath my previous talk about faith and mental health, and I found out that he actually died not all that long ago. He was 90 and he had Parkinson's disease. He had not been well for some time, but an amazing man. So, the ins and out of rejection. Now, in my early formative Christian years, I'm just reading a few notes that I've got on here off my computer. I used to work in the city of Adelaide, which is still the city I live in a suburb of Adelaide anyway. And in the city there are a number of Christian bookshops. And I used to, as a new Christian, I frequented them in my lunch hour just about every day. I'd sometimes go there. And I had a really huge hunger for knowledge and and finding things that would practically help me in my newfound Christian faith. I'd become a Christian at the age of 28. And I usually bought about one new Christian book a week for quite a while, hence I built up quite a collection. A lot of them I've still got here, and a lot of them I've bought multiple copies of, and a lot of them have since been donated somewhere else as well. So there are some standouts in that collection, which the most important ones I still have, and a lot of others came along later. So Charles Solomon, his first book that I came across in a Christian bookshop was called Handbook to Happiness. I'll show you that one. There's Handbook to Happiness. A guide to victorious living and effective counselling. That was his first book that came out. And the second one was the Ins and Out of Rejection. I've just ordered another 3 copies of this from a second-hand shop because I like to give them away. And then another one was Counselling with the Mind of Christ, which was also a very important follow-up book. And then he wrote another one called The Rejection Syndrome, which features a lot of the material that's in these books. And there's lots of other things he's written as well over the years. I've been a great promoter of his work ever since those days. And his, I think I alluded into my last article on or video on this subject of faith and mental health, that I had some wonderful Christian counselling back at the time when I had it. And but Dr. Solomon's books helped consolidate what I had learned in my own counselling experience. He started up an organisation called Grace Fellowship International, which is still going. A counselling ministry based on equipping everyday Christians with tools to help others. He visited Australia a couple of times, including here in Adelaide, South Australia. Now, I did not get to hear him in person, but managed to get cassette tapes of his talks and his colleagues when they visited Australia. At one stage I was involved in as a rehabilitation counsellor. I didn't have any formal qualifications. I got thrown in at the deep end. I don't know whether you remember when the whole RSI epidemic hit the world, or particularly in Australia, with people having problems getting used to keyboards, and they have all the pains in their arms and all this sort of stuff. And it became a huge problem in Australia. And I was thrown in at the deep end in the job I had, trying to help people overcome that, as in a large government department. And his teaching, Dr. Solomon's teaching, helped me understand a lot of the people I was meeting who were sitting there before me and telling me their life story. And the understanding I had from Dr. Solomon helped me to understand where they were coming from a lot of the time. Of course, I wasn't in a position to be able to apply Christian teaching, but I could certainly apply Christian understanding and empathy to those situations. And even back then, I exchanged a couple of letters with him way back then, because he'd done some similar sort of counselling in a department, and I asked him about how that got on, and how he got on with that and what he did with it. He'd since lost some of the information about that, and he didn't know whether it would help me or not in what I was doing, but I would have been curious to find out anyway. But anyway, I'm just going to show you a conference brochure. He came to Australia a couple of times. Here's a brochure that came round about back in those days, and they were running some seminars in Sydney. And it says on here, if I'm a Christian, why can't I live the Christian life? Why do I feel so inferior and so afraid? Find out who you are in Christ. Discover how to experience the victorious life in Christ. And I've got tapes from these sort of conferences. I never ever got to one myself, but I did correspond with the guy who was organising them a couple of times, and I got copies of tapes sent to me as well, I think, from him. So this was they did a 3-day conference followed up by a 5-day workshop. You can do a lot of these things online these days with Grace Fellowship International, and they were wonderful seminars, and he did some of that in Adelaide here as well, which I missed out on, unfortunately. In later years I discovered that when he was in Adelaide he had actually, I think actually had stayed with, no, I might be wrong, I thought he'd actually stayed with, no, it was someone else. Forget all that. Another author I'll talk about later on who stayed with one of my former pastors. So, I'm going to read a few extracts from his books. First of all, I'll read from the Handbook to Happiness. And I'm going to read a little bit of the foreword by Dr. Paul Cashel. Cashel, K-A-S-C-H-E-L. And I've got a whole series of his tapes that I've got here, and he was I'll just read the foreword to this book, the Handbook to Happiness, the first one here, and then I might explain something else a little bit that I learned that Dr. Cashel mentioned in his tapes. He says here, having begun my own career in medicine as a family physician in Wisconsin, I was soon led to see that human needs were more than physical. The emotional needs of my patients were encountered daily. Formal psychiatric residency gave me new credentials and qualifications to meet these needs. Following this training, I received an offer to serve as medical director at the Mental Health Center in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Many times I've had the opportunity to help people, but also many times I had run into dead ends, as insight provided understanding but left people essentially powerless to utilise that new information. It's one thing to know what's causing something, but how do you deal with it? And how they could utilise that new information to harness it to a reliable power source so they could move ahead. Many new methods of treatment were devised only to find recurrence and chronicity of a haunting plague. Was there not a better way? Was there not something more? And he goes on to say a few more things into the foreword. And he joined the team of Grace Fellowship International. And I remember listening to one of his talks where he said he was in charge of this secular psychiatric hospital. He was the head man. And he said we learned all sorts of ways of giving therapy to people, how to help them. And he said to a certain extent, which he's saying there, we were able to help. However, he said he likened it to a person would come to them and their life would be like a muddy road full of potholes. And they'd been stepping in and out of these potholes and stumbling over them for ages. And he said what we used to do with our therapy was to fill those potholes up would fill them up with dirt so that they could pass over the top. But he said the trouble was, as soon as one big storm came away, it washed all the dirt out and the potholes were there again. And that's how he likened it to the counselling, the secular counselling that he was giving. It was helping to a certain extent, but it wasn't providing a lasting solution to where that person was going in their life. Very profound thinking, I think. I've passed that on to a lot of people. So, where are we at to? That was a little bit of the Handbook to Happiness. One of the things that I picked up in here also, which I talk in the preamble to my YouTube channel, is Dr. Solomon and Dr. Paul are talking about the concept of that we are body, soul and spirit, and it's how you bring the body, the soul and spirit into harmony with each other, into harmony with God. That's when you find the way to happiness, the Handbook to Happiness. Essential to understanding the human condition, to understand that we are made up like that. The ins and out of rejection. This was the one that I've given away a few copies of this, and I used to lend it to people, particularly when I used to be counselling a lot of people. I used to lend it out to them. Some people got it, some people didn't. So what can we find out about in this one? Let's have a look and see here. Find some of the opening words in here. I read quite a bit of this because it's an important book in my opinion. Preface to Part 1. The author has found, that's Dr. Solomon, that persons who have mental emotional disturbances usually have not had their need for love and affection met in their childhood, and the effect has continued into their adult lives. The behaviour of such persons falls into many predictable patterns, which are presented in Part 1 under the heading, the Rejection Syndrome. Since the need for love and acceptance is universal, the principles laid out are applicable to all those who have not had their needs met. Illogical and bizarre behaviours have their roots in an inner need, which can usually be traced to the fact that the love needs have not been fulfilled. Even those who have loving and accepting parents may not feel assured of being loved in a manner which gives them security, thus making it possible for them to succeed in life. If you allude back to my previous video on this topic, I discovered when I had counselling, as my counsellor Frank Hunting had pointed out to me, that I was suffering from rejection. And I had a lovely family life, and my mum and dad were great, but there were certain things that he pointed out to me at the time, that how I reacted to them, I saw them as rejection, things that not only happened at home, but also in the schoolyard and places like that as well. So, this book, along with the Handbook to Happiness by the author, is written to help those suffering from depression, loneliness, discouragement, defeat, or from more serious emotional and mental symptoms, understanding the cause, and to provide a satisfying and lasting answer. And it's an introduction to a Christ-centred approach to counselling, which may be understood and shared with others without the necessity of advanced formal education. Quite often when I used to work in the government department, and more recently before I retired, I'd be talking to a lot of people on the phone who were in trouble in the government department I was working for, and I had a lot of insight because of all this training that I'd had through these books. And sometimes people would say to me, what qualification do you have? Do you have a degree or something like that? And I used to quote what Dr. Solomon quotes in one of his books here. I say, well, I've actually got a degree in the USAF. And then I'd get a blank response, and I'd say that means a degree in the universal, I'll start again, the degree in the universal suffering and affliction, a degree in universal suffering and affliction, that's it, USAF, universal suffering and affliction, and all of us have a degree in that. We all have been through the hard times and the good times of life, and we learn from it, hopefully. Sometimes though we don't. I'm trying to point people who there might be one person watching this today that needs to hear this and follow up on some of these things. So I'm trying to point people in that direction. Counselling with the Mind of Christ was how he goes into some practical ways that people can be trained up in their own churches and whatever, because he's talking to Christians here, and there's some fantastic information in here about counselling and interviews you can do with people and how you can help them. And he's very good at doing these, what he calls these wheel and line diagrams. These sort of things here. There you are, one there on the body, the soul and the spirit, and all the interactions. And a truly remarkable man who's now gone with his Lord, but he was just someone that was being obedient to what Christ had led him down that track. And he went through, if you read in his book, you'll find out that before he came to that point where he learnt all these things, he had been one who was contemplating suicide himself. He wasn't coping with life. He was an engineer in, I think, in the aeronautical industry. So you find helpful diagrams there, and he also was an amazing poet and poem, and a lot of the poems he writes in his books are very helpful, and they are all based on the scriptures, the scriptures from the Bible. So I hope you found that interesting. Follow up and see if you can look up Grace Fellowship International on the internet, and the books that Dr. Solomon's done. There's heaps of material there. You can actually join in and do some of their training online if you wish. So once again, thanks for watching. I'm going to do another one of these coming up before too much longer. I'm going to be talking about a similar person actually who's still alive, Neil Anderson, and I'm going to talk about some of the books of Neil Anderson that I find very helpful. So thanks again for watching. Like if you like, subscribe if you wish, and I'll see you next time.